restricted resources. And so it makes sense for you to conserve them. And I'm telling you that partly for practical reasons too, because this is a very useful thing to know. If you're arguing with someone, you want to argue about the smallest possible thing that you could argue about that might fix the problem. You want to really specify it. It's like, what's going on at a micro level, and what's the minimum that I would require to be satisfied with the outcome. And if you're, this is especially true in intimate relationships, is like, if someone's bugging you and you want them to change, you think, well, how can I be minimally bothered by this, and what's the tiniest amount of change I could request that might satisfy me? Because otherwise the argument will come unglued, and every time you guys try to discuss a problem, you'll start talking about whether you should even be together, and then you're done, because you'll never solve a problem. And then you won't be together, because you'll never solve a problem. So, okay. So, here's a way to think about perception. So, let's say that this is the thing you're trying to look at. I called that the thing in itself. Now, that's a schematic of a thing in itself. So the thing in itself, that's an old philosophical concept, and I think it came from Kant, but I'm not sure about that. It might be older than that. And the thing in itself is what you could see if you could see everything about something, but you can't. So it's a hypothetical entity. And maybe, who knows, if I was looking at you like the thing in itself, maybe I could see every level of your being from the subatomic up to this level of perception, and then beyond. I could see your family relationships. I could see how they were nested in your societal relationships, economic relationships, political relationships, the ecosystem as a whole. Like, I would see all these levels at the same time. Of course, I don't, because I can't. What I see instead is, first of all, you're radically simplified by my senses, because they're just not acute enough to say see you at a microscopic level, and they're not comprehensive enough to see your connections across time. So my senses filter a bunch of you from me right away, and then I'm also filtered from you by your willingness to act like I want while we're together, because you could be doing all sorts of strange things at the moment, but you're not. And so you're helping me simplify my perceptions of you by agreeing to play the same game that I'm playing while we occupy the same space. And that's basically politeness. That's the mark of someone who's well socialized. You walk in somewhere, you get the game, you play the game, and you don't scare the hell out of everybody. And that's partly how we keep our emotions stabilized, because, you know, if you're like a Freudian, you think, well, as long as your ego is well constituted, you can keep your emotions under control. It's like, yes and no. Mostly no. I like the Piagetian idea better, which is, if you're well socialized, you're awake enough to identify the game that's going on wherever you go. And then you play that game immediately, and so do all the other socialized primates, and so then you can just understand the game. You don't have to understand them, thank God. You can just understand the game, and as long as the game continues, you don't have to be nervous, because you at least know what's going to happen, and maybe you even know how to get what you want in that game. And so that, again, that's really worth thinking about, because we talked about this before, about why people want to maintain their culture. It isn't just because their culture is a belief system that helps them orient themselves in the world. It's because a belief system is a game that everyone who shares that belief system is playing, and the fact that everybody's playing means nobody needs to get upset. So it isn't like the belief system is directly inhibiting the emotions. That isn't how it works. So, and it's not like the culture is just a belief system. It's only secondarily a belief system, man. Mostly it's a game that people are actively engaging in. That's way more important than the beliefs that go along with it. You don't even need the damn beliefs. You know, that's why wolves can live with each other. They don't know they don't have a belief system exactly. Mostly they have they have a game. It's the wolf game, roughly speaking, and all the wolves know how to play it. And so that's that. That's how they keep themselves organized in their packs. A lot of it's externalized. And so, okay, so anyway, so the thing in itself, that's a very complicated thing. It's got multiple dimensions, multiple levels. And then it's worse than that, because it doesn't only have multiple levels, but all of those levels move across time, and every one of those levels shifts as it moves across time. And so I like to think of the thing in itself like a symphony. I think that's a good model. I think that's why we like music, in fact, because music shows you a multi-level reality that unfolds and shifts across time within some parameters, right? Because it's not just chaos. The music has an element of predictability and an element of unpredictability, and it has these multiple levels, and that's sort of what everything in the world is like. It's what the world is like. So this is even that is just a conceptual model of the thing in itself. First of all, that's only got 2 dimensions instead of 3, because it could be a cube. And then it has, even a cube has 3 dimensions instead of 4, because if that was a cube, adding the 3rd dimension, then it would also be a cube that would transform and shift as it moved across time. And that's what the thing in itself is, but that's too damn complicated. So then the question is, when you look at it, what do you see? And the answer is, to some degree, it depends on what you want to use it for. And so I would say, well, here, look at the different ways you can look at this. You might say, what is this? And somebody could say, well, it's a rectangle. And would you say that's correct? It's like, well, it's not correct because there's not a one-to-one correspondence, but it might be a useful conceptualization. If you think about that as a box, it could contain that. And if you were carrying the box, you'd only have to be concerned about the box, and so that would be fine. That's a good functional simplification. That one's a little higher resolution because it says, well, yeah, it's actually 4 rectangles. And that one says, well, wait, think about that as an orchard that someone's looking at from the top. You want to figure out how to walk from south to north. Well, you got a little map there. Because you can think of those as bars instead of collections of dots. Piaget showed that children will automatically do this. So for example, if you take 6 dots and put them in a row, and you take the same 6 dots and you stretch them out so the row is this much longer, and then you ask the child where there are more dots, the child will say that there are more dots where it's longer, because they're flipping in some sense between the perception of the individual dots and the perception of the shape that the array of dots makes. And so the shape is longer because you can see it as a rectangle, and so they think, well, longer is bigger, bigger is more, there's got to be more dots. So, well, whoop. And then there's this one, which is sort of an amalgam of this one, and then that one. There's that one, and that's the highest resolution model of that that's still a simplification. And, you know, what I like about this diagram is that, you know, people say, well, the facts are the facts, and what we're disagreeing about is our opinion about the facts. It's like, no. Yes, you have an opinion about the facts, but the world is so horribly complex that you can actually disagree about the facts themselves. And I think an ideology does that to people very, very commonly. So I saw this movie once that Naomi Klein made. If I tell you the same story, tell me, okay? Because I don't want to tell you the same story, but I might. So she went down to Argentina after a bunch of money had got out of Argentina because of a financial collapse, and she went to a factory that had been padlocked, and it was a heavy machinery factory, and the workers had decided they were going to undo the padlocks and go build machines, you know, to hell with the owner who shut it down. And so she went down and made this movie and followed these workers around and, you know, showed how catastrophic their lives had been because they'd lost their livelihood in this big financial crash. And so that was really interesting. But then she went and interviewed the guy who owned the factory, and she treated him like he was like a cipher in some sense. Instead of asking him how he got the factory, what he wanted to do with it, how it fit in with his life plans, why he shut it down instead of continuing it, you know, she didn't get the backstory on him. She just left him in the evil capitalist box and went on with the film. And it was like, it wasn't like what she did wasn't true, but it was only half true. And it was half true because she could perceive the complexity of the workers, having sympathy for them, but as far as she was concerned, the enemy, the owner, had no complexity. He was just bad capitalist, and that's how it was left in the movie. I found it profoundly unsatisfying because I wanted to know, okay, it's like, you know that these workers are suffering. It's not self-evident that you want your damn factory closed. You'd think you'd want it open so you could be building things. It's like, who are you? What are you doing? Why is this justifiable? Have a question about it. Well, you can take this infinite set of facts and then you subject it to your filters, and you let some of the facts through, and they're facts. But what about all the facts that you don't let through? That's the thing. And that's what the gorilla video shows too. It's like, yeah, you got the basketball count right, but you missed the big primate. And you might say, well, your priorities were a bit skewed in that circumstance because you were rearranging the deck chairs as the Titanic sank, you know, as the old joke goes. And so it's very much useful to think always, well, it isn't just your damn opinion that's biased, although it is. It's your perceptions that are biased. So, well, and with your words it's even more. So you say, well, you can't see the thing in itself because it's too complex, so you perceive it simpler than it is. And some of that perceptual simplification is dependent on your aims. So that's a vicious one because it pulls the value structure that you're ensconced within into your perceptions. It pulls it into the realm of facts itself. And then you do another, I think about this as a compression. You know, you can compress a photograph by getting rid of redundant information. That's sort of what you're doing here. So you're like one of these squares, little black squares here, black rectangles, compresses all of those. It's like we're going to treat those as if they're grayish black. Same thing happens here. So we're blurring across them. So we have a much less high resolution image here. So you take the thing in itself, you perceive it as a low resolution representation, and then you take that low resolution representation and you replace that with a word, and so the word is a twofold compression. And then when someone tosses you the word, you unpack it into the low resolution perception and then maybe into the world itself if you can do that, but probably not. So that's what we're doing. We're taking the complex world, we fold it into a simple perception, we fold that into a word, we throw the word to someone else and they unpack it. And the only way you can unpack it, of course, is if you've had enough similar experience so that you have the reference for the word already in your experience. So, which is why you have to use simplified language with children, right? Because there's no point tossing a child a concept that he or she can't unpack. So we compress a very complex reality through a very, very small keyhole. That's basically our cognitive processing. Okay, so then here's the next kind of argument. This goes along with the science religion argument that I was making earlier, which I want to unpack a little bit more. I think that fundamentalists and atheistic scientists have the same problem. The fundamentalists, so we could say the Christian fundamentalists in the US, make the proposition that biblical stories, we'll call them mythological stories, are literal representations of the truth. And that might be true depending on what you mean by literal. But what they mean by literal, or what they attempt to make literal mean, is that they're in the same category as scientific facts. Because they don't have the idea that there are different ways of approaching truth, and that truths can serve different purposes. They don't have a sense that your definition of truth is actually something like a tool rather than an ontological statement about the reality of the world. And so the fundamentalists basically make the proposition that the idea that God created the world in 6 days 5,000 years ago is literally true. And they get the 5,000 year estimate, by the way, by going through the genealogies in the Old Testament and adding up the hypothetical ages and figuring out, you know, how long before Moses Adam lived. And some bishop did that back in I think it was in the mid-1800s. I might be wrong about that, but it was somewhere back about that time. And more or less that's been accepted as canonical fact ever since. And then the scientists say, well, yeah, those are empirical truths, they're just wrong. See, and that's the only difference there is between the fundamentalists and the atheist scientists. The fundamentalists say, those are fundamental scientific truths and they're right, and the scientists say, well, they're scientific truths, they just happen to be wrong. Well, I think that's a stupid argument, personally. I mean, for a bunch of reasons. One is that the people who wrote the ancient stories that we have access to were in no way, shape, or form scientists. you know, modern people tend to think that you think like a scientist, and people have always thought that way. First of all, you do not think like a scientist. Even scientists hardly even think like scientists. But if you're not scientifically trained, you don't think like a scientist at all. So one of the things, for example, that characterizes your thinking is confirmation bias. And so if you have a theory, what you do is wander around in the world looking for reasons why it's true. And a scientist does exactly the opposite of that in the little tiny narrow domain where he or she is actually capable of being a scientist. And what they have is a theory and look for a way to prove it wrong. But believe me, you don't run around doing that. I mean, you can train yourself, so now and then you can do that. You know, you can learn to listen to people, for example, on the off chance that you might be wrong. But that is by no means a natural way of thinking. And of course, the fundamental philosophical axioms of the scientific method weren't developed until Descartes and Bacon and who else? Descartes, Bacon. There's one more. Anyways, the name escapes me at the moment. But you can argue about when science emerged, but it certainly emerged in its articulated form within the last 1,000 years. I think you could say even more specifically that it emerged in the last 500 years. Now you might argue with that and say, well, what about the Greeks and other people who were fairly technologically sophisticated, or who invented geometry or that kind of thing? But yeah, bare precursors to the idea of empirical observation. Aristotle, for example, when he was writing down his knowledge of the world, it never occurred to him to actually go out in the world and look at it to see if what he assumed about it was true. And it certainly never occurred to Aristotle to get 20 people to go look at the same thing independently, write down exactly how they went about doing it, compare the records, and then extract out what was common. I mean, that seems self-evident to us to some degree, but you know, it was by no means self-evident to anyone 500 years ago, and people still don't do it. So it's not plausible, if you know anything about the history of ideas, it's not plausible to posit that stories about the nature of reality that existed before 500 years ago were scientific in any but the most cursory of ways. So why we have that argument continually is somewhat beyond me. Part of the reason is, though, that everyone, fundamentalists included, really believe in scientific facts. Even though they hate it, they'll use computers, they'll fly. Computers wouldn't work unless quantum mechanics were correct. Like, the fact that you use a high-tech device indicates through your action that you actually accept the theories upon which it's predicated. Right? The same as flying, same as anything you do in a complex technological society. You're stuck with it. You're reading by the lights. Do they work? Yeah, they work. Well, so it's really hard for people who are trying to hold on to a way of looking at the world that appears to contradict the scientific claims when everything they do is predicated on their acceptance of the validity of the scientific claims. It's really problematic for people, and it's problematic in a real way, I think, because one of the problems with the scientific viewpoint is it doesn't tell you anything about what you should do with your life. It doesn't solve the problem of value at all. In fact, it might make it more difficult, because one of the fundamental scientific claims, roughly speaking, is that every fact is of equal utility, at least from a scientific perspective, right? There's no hierarchy of facts. It's not exactly true, because you can think of one theory as more true than another. But that boils down to saying that it's more useful than another. So I don't think that that's a really good exception. Okay, so fine. You got the scientific atheists on one end, and you got the religious fundamentalists on the other, and what they both agree on, whether they like it or not, is that there's so much power in the scientific method that it's difficult to dispute the validity of scientific facts. And they seem to exist in contradiction to the older, archaic stories, if you also accept them as fact-based accounts. So what do we do about that? Well, if you're on the scientific atheist end of things, you say, well, those old stories are just superstitious science, second-rate, barbaric, archaic forms of science. You just dispense with them. They're nothing but trouble. And if you're on the fundamentalist side, you say, well, we'll try to shoehorn science into this framework, and really that doesn't work very well. It doesn't work very well with the claims of evolution, for example. In fact, it works very badly. And that's a problem, because evolutionary theory is like, it's a killer theory. And it's really, really hard and like it's not a complete theory, and there's lots of things we don't know about evolution, but you know, trying to hand wave that away, that's not going to work without dispensing with most of biology. So that's a big problem. So here's another way of thinking about it. You don't just need one way of looking at the world. Maybe you need two ways of looking at the world, and I'm not exactly sure how they should be related to one another, like which should take precedence under which circumstance. But one problem is, what's the world made of? You know, what's the world conceptualized as an objective place made of? And the other is, how should you conduct yourself while you're alive? And there's no reason to assume that those questions can be answered using the same approach. I mean, physics has its methods, and chemistry has its methods, and biology has its methods. So a method for obtaining the truth can be bound to a domain. So why would we necessarily assume that you could use the same set of tools to represent the world as a place of objects and to represent it as a place in which a biological creature would act? I mean, anyways, I'm suggesting that we don't view it that way, that we have two different viewpoints. Maybe they can be brought together, although it's not obvious how, but that it's not a tenable solution to get rid of one in favor of the other. And I think the reason for that is that you need to know how to conduct yourself in the world. You have to have a value system. You can't even look at the damn world without a value system. It's not possible. Your emotional health is dependent on a value system. The way you interact with other people is dependent on a value system. There's no getting away from it. And you say, well, there's no justification for any value system from a scientific perspective. You're going to draw that conclusion that no value system is valid. Where the hell does that leave you? There's no down, there's no up, there's no rationale for moving in any direction. There's not even really any rationale for living, and so people say things like that. Well, why the hell should I care what happens in a million years? Who's going to know the difference? It's like, yeah, true, stupid, but true. And the reason I think it's stupid is because it's just a game. You know, I can take anything of any sort and find a context in which it's irrelevant. It's just a rational game. It's like, who cares if 100 children freeze to death in a blizzard? What difference is it going to make a billion years? Well, what do you say to someone who says that? You say, well, seems like the wrong frame of reference, bucko. That's what it looks like to me. You know, because at some point you question the damn frame of reference, not what you derive from it. And it certainly seems to me that situations like that don't allow you to use that kind of frame of reference. There's something inhumane about it. And that trumps the logic, or at least it should. And if it doesn't, then all hell breaks loose, and that doesn't seem to be a good thing. Okay, so I have this quote from Shakespeare here. He says, all the world's a stage and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts. Well, it's the sort of thing that you'd expect a dramatist to pen, but that's how he looked at the world. And we still watch Shakespeare's plays some hundreds of years later because there seems to be something essential captured in them. Something about how people do act, but more importantly, I think, how people should and shouldn't act. Because what fun is it going to a play that doesn't outline how someone should and how someone shouldn't act? You want a good guy, or a couple of them. Maybe they can be complex interminglings of good and bad, you know, that makes it more sophisticated. And you want a bad guy, or a bad, you know, you always want to see that contrasted, either within a character or between characters. And it's because you want to know how to live properly, that's how to be a good person, and you want to know how to live improperly, how to be a bad person, so you can watch out for people like that, or so you can figure out what that means for yourself. It's compelling, and that's another thing that's worth thinking about. Why is it compelling? And it's compelling to everyone. That's the thing that's so cool, is that there aren't that many phenomena that you can point to that are compelling to everyone. Music is close. It's a very rare person who doesn't like at least some genre of music, no matter how narrow. But the other one is stories. You're hard-pressed to find someone, especially if they're younger, who doesn't like stories. Why? Is it a waste of time? Or is there something going on? Well, I think it's not only not a waste of time, it's actually the most fundamentally important thing you can possibly do, because there's no difference between understanding stories and figuring out how to get along in the world. So, and there's a tight relationship between the story that you inhabit that structures your behavior and the games that Piaget talked about that organize people's behavior. You know, to some degree, the reason that we can all sit in this room together like this is because a huge chunk of the value system that guides our behavior is shared. So I'm lecturing and you're sitting in the classroom, and that distinguishes us to some degree, but you know that that's partly merely a consequence of the difference in our age. It's the same trajectory, we just happen to occupy different positions in a value hierarchy that we both accept. And so as long as you feel that that's fair and just, then you're not going to object to it. But I'm here in the classroom for many of the same reasons that you're here in the classroom. If you look at the higher order parts of the value structure, and maybe right out at the end of that, because I've tried to figure out, if you push why you're doing what you're doing right now to its ultimate limit, so you can't get a story that's superordinate to that, it's something like, well, you believe that the investigation of the world to acquire knowledge is worthwhile. Otherwise, what the hell are you here for? And even if, you know, 80% of your motivation is to get a good, stable job, fair enough, there's still something outside of that, because the whole culture says, well, you're more likely to be able to function properly in a good, stable job if you're the sort of person who knows how to go out in the world and forage for information usefully. And I think that's very much analogous to the hero story. It's like you go out and you search the unknown to find something of value. And so fundamentally that's what we're doing in the classroom. And the reason we can all organize our behavior is because we accept that framework. Consciously would be we know how to articulate it. Unconsciously it's, well, it doesn't matter, we know how to act out the patterns. Whether we know can say the rules or not, doesn't matter. Same as a wolf pack. We know the procedures, and you could describe them with an articulated value structure. Let's take a break. Okay, so let's go back to the complexity problem. See, I actually think it's in some sense, it's the fundamental problem. When you read about the terror management theorist types, they think that death is the fundamental problem. And that's a good argument, because it's definitely a fundamental problem, but I think it's a subset of the complexity problem. And the reason I think that is because sometimes people's lives become so complex that they'd rather be dead. So, and the reason they seek death through suicide is to make the complexity go away, because complexity causes suffering if it's uncontrolled. You know, things just get beyond your control. And that can happen, you know, if you're hit by 3 or 4 catastrophes at the same time. You know, maybe you have, oh, the political system collapses, there's hyperinflation, you lose your job, and you have someone that you love or 2 people die, and maybe you get cancer, something like that. Like that, those things happen to people, and they just think, well, there's no getting out of this. Like, it's just too much. And you know, one of the things that's very interesting about being a psychologist is that what you learn if you're going to be a psychologist is that people come to you with mental illnesses, and that's almost never true. People come to you because their lives are so damn complicated they cannot stay on top of them in any way that doesn't make it look like they're just going to get more complicated. And so then that causes symptoms. You know, it's like, there's this old idea, it's sort of a metaphor for genetic susceptibility. Take a balloon and blow it up until it's beyond its tolerance, it's going to blow out at the weakest point. Well, that's sort of what a genetic susceptibility is. If I just keep adding complexity on top of you, at some point you'll blow out at your weakest point. You know, maybe you'll get physiologically ill, maybe you'll start drinking, maybe you'll develop an anxiety disorder, maybe you'll get OCD, maybe you'll get depressed, whatever. There'll be something about you that's the weakest point, and if I just push, that's where you'll blow out. So that's a mental illness, but those things almost never just happen. Sometimes, but not very often. Usually people have just been hammered like 2 or 3 different ways, and then they collapse in the direction of their biological weakness, and then maybe you put them back together, but it's almost always a complexity related phenomena rather than a mental illness related phenomena. Not always, but almost always. So, okay, so now you got this complexity problem, and you think, well, you deal with it conceptually. And that's sort of akin to the idea that it's belief systems that protect you from death anxiety. The ideas are roughly comparable, but again, that's wrong. It's the sort of thing only a psychologist could think up, because psychologists think that everything about you happens inside your head, so to speak, in your psyche, but that's not true. There's a huge chunk of you that's outside of you completely. And so this is a really good example. Like, you know, we know the oldest cities. This is a medieval city in France, a beautiful old city. Old cities were walled, and the reason for that was because they were places of wealth, and if you didn't put walls around them, then other people would come in and steal everything and kill you. So like having some walls was a good idea, like the same as having walls in your house is a good idea. Walls between your rooms are a good idea, or borders between categories are a good idea. And so part of the way you simplify the world is by building walls around your space, because then a whole bunch of things can't come in, and so you don't even have to think about them. It's not conceptual, it's practical. And so, and you know, one of the things I think I figured out recently is the fundamental political difference between people. And it looks to me like the fundamental political difference is how many walls should there be around your stuff? And the ultimate liberal answer is 0. And the ultimate conservative answer is, well, bring on those walls, man. And what's interesting about both those perspectives, first of all, is that there's temperamental contributions to them, and second, that they're both valid. So one of the mysteries, I believe, that permeates psychometric psychology right now is why the temperamental factors that influence politics are those particular temperamental factors. So there's 5, let's say, right? This classic big 5: extroversion, neuroticism, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and openness. Well, the biggest predictors of political allegiance, forget about the politically correct types for a minute, but on the liberal to conservative axis is that the liberals are low in conscientiousness and high in openness, and the conservatives are high in conscientiousness and low in openness. And so then you think, well, why those two traits? That's the first question. And the second question is, why those two traits together, given that they're not very highly correlated, right? They're really quite independent. So why do they co-vary along the political axis? And I think this is the reason. I think it's exactly that, is that open people like to live on the periphery of boundaries. And they like to break boundaries between things, because interesting things happen when you think a different way, when you think outside of the box, so to speak. That's what open people do. They always think outside of the box, no matter what box you put them in. You know, and sometimes you meet people that are so open that they're completely disorganized. Their thought process is almost completely associational, like a dreamer. They just jump from one thing to another, and they're very interesting to talk to. It's very hard for those people to get their lives together, because they're interested in absolutely everything, and their attention just flits all over the place. And so they're open, and that actually does go along with higher intelligence, generally speaking. So, and then if they're low in conscientiousness, they don't see any utility in order. And order, like orderly people, because that's part of conscientiousness and the biggest determiner of political belief in the conscientious domain, the orderly people like to have everything in its separate place and properly structured. And so, you know, their world is box, inside a shelf of boxes, and then that shelf of boxes is inside another box, and all those boxes are nice and neat and tight, nothing inside them is touching, and everything in every box is the same thing. And you know, you can see you can see the utility in that, and that, as far as we've been able to tell, is also associated with disgust sensitivity. And people are disgusted, generally speaking, when things that shouldn't be touching are touching, like something horrible stuck to you, for example. That produces a very visceral sense of disgust. And it's a boundary violation, because that's what disgust is. It indexes a boundary violation. And how separate people should be from one another as individuals or in groups is an entirely debatable issue, because there's huge advantages when people mingle and mix, and there's huge dangers when people mingle and mix. And so at some point you say, well, the dangers are overwhelming the positives, and at another point you say, well, the positives are overwhelming the dangers, and you have a continual argument about that with yourself, but more importantly with people who have different temperament than you. You know, and the terrible temptation is to assume that only those people who have your temperament are correct. And that's just, those other temperaments wouldn't exist if that was true. I mean, if you look at it from, just say if you look at it from a strictly biological perspective. So anyways, one of the things we do to simplify the world is to frame it. physically. And so you look at this, you've got wall number 1 and then you have wall number 2, but then inside the walls you have walls around everything. All these houses are walls, and inside the houses there are walls as well. And so everything is, and what you do when you put walls around things is you make part of the world simpler, right? Constantly. If the reason you have a house is so that everybody and his dog isn't in your house. You just want those few people that you can barely tolerate in your house, and not all those other strangers, and God only knows what they're going to do. You'll still invite people in now and then, because maybe you're sick and tired and bored of the people that are in your house, and so you want a little bit of new information. But you want those barriers to be there so that you can voluntarily modulate the information flow. Okay, so that's the first thing you do. And then you set up rules with everybody else. It says, well, I'm going to have some walls so you can't come in, but what I'm going to do is pay you for that privilege by letting you have some walls where people can't come in. And so I think that's analogous. I was thinking about the issue of discrimination in relationship to sex, because I've been thinking a lot about discrimination lately, because everybody thinks discrimination is a bad idea, which is a very stupid proposition, because you're discriminating all the time. And the most fundamental form of discrimination is choice of sexual partner. And so you might say, well, why should that even be allowed? Because it is the most fundamental form of discrimination. So for example, almost everyone is racially prejudiced when it comes to sexual partners. So you think, well, is that a, what about, do you use age as an exclusionary criteria? Probably. Do you use physical attractiveness? Only insofar as you're able, right? You use it completely if you could get away with it, roughly speaking, but you can't, because the most attractive people aren't going to be anywhere near you. So you can't do it, but you'd like to. Health, yes. Strength, yes. Wealth, yes. Education, definitely. So it's unbelievably discriminatory. And so you might say, well, why is that justifiable? And it seems to me that it's something like, well, you get to say no to me if I get to say no to you. It's something like that. We've agreed that everybody gets to discriminate on that basis, and because everybody can do it, then it's fair. It's something like that. It's very much worth thinking about. I don't know if you know this, but in Huxley's book, Brave New World, where the family had been completely demolished, right, and children were conceived in bottles and given and produced in factories. So the whole idea of the relationship between sex and procreation had become a taboo. One of the mantras, the slogans of the society was, everyone belongs to everyone else. And so it was actually a social faux pas to refuse to sleep with someone, just as it was a social faux pas to have any exclusionary relationship. Because another thing that you might notice is that there's nothing more discriminatory than falling in love with someone. It's like, you're special, and all the rest of you? No. So it's the ultimate exclusionary act, right? And yet we presume that that's an acceptable, not only acceptable, we demand that as a right. And well, that's worth thinking about a lot. Anyways, okay, so what you're doing is, by agreeing to this segregation and boxing, what you're doing is carving off little bits of the world that are simple enough so that someone like you can live for some amount of time there without too much danger. And everyone agrees to do that, roughly speaking, because everybody needs to engage in that process of simplification and safety provision. And so we have towns, and the towns are nothing but boxes, but inside boxes. So there's a good schematic of a little house, and you can see that even inside the same place we segregate off rooms for different purposes. And then what's interesting too is that we set up those rooms as little dramatic spaces, right? So you furnish them, and you furnish them with things that tell you how to behave in that room. So a table and chairs tells you that's where you're going to eat, and that's where people are going to sit, and they're going to sit facing each other. That has certain implications because the chairs don't face the walls, they face each other. And you have a living room where it's comfortable and there's a fire, and you're setting up little stages basically, so that just like kids do when they pretend, they all assign each other roles, and then they lay out a little drama. And that's what you do when you invite someone over. Well, let's sit in the living room. Well, you'll probably get a drink if you sit in the living room, and hypothetically you're going to have some conversation. And so it's a bounded place, there are rules that apply, and then you get to have a little exploration inside that set of bounded rules. And if you're open, you're going to discuss all sorts of things, and if you're conservative, and closed, then you're going to discuss a very, very small subset of things. And so hopefully everyone will agree on that. So that's one form of binding. Then another is, well, we put boxes around each other when it comes to groups. And so this is I think this is a picture from the Democratic Convention when Obama was elected, if I remember correctly. But anyways, what happens is that people segregate themselves into little microgroups like Democrats and Republicans, and they basically do that on a temperamental grounds, right, fundamentally. And then they produce these games that everyone knows how to play, and that's another form of simplification. So when you bring all these people together at a political convention, it's not like they all have the same ideas. They don't. And it could degenerate into chaos, and sometimes that happens. You get big demonstrations at these places, and sometimes people throw tear gas and all of that. But mostly speaking, it's pretty peaceful. And the reason for that is that there's a set of procedures in place that have some historical justification, that are embedded within a shared cultural and belief system. And everybody goes there and agrees to play by the rules, roughly speaking. And so then they can elect a candidate. They can kind of flip it down to a binary choice for the election, right? Yes or no, something like that. And nobody gets killed, usually. So hooray for that. That's a hell of a thing to pull off, to be able to generate out of 300 million people, 2 people to run for the highest office, then let everyone play a game to determine who they're going to be, and then to have the bloody thing function stably through power transitions. Like, that never happens, right? That's a complete bloody miracle, and hardly any societies have ever pulled it off. The power transition being the really important thing. Because a tyrant can be stable for a while, but usually what happens is he dies and all hell breaks loose. So I think George Washington, I think it was George Washington that said, or had said about him, the reason that he was a great leader wasn't because he was president, but because he stopped being president. And that's really worth thinking about. So then, the next thing that sort of simplifies your world is actually your physiological structure, right? And we talked about that a little bit. Well, you can only see things that are in front of you, not things that are to the side or behind you. You know, you can only see a very narrow chunk of the electromagnetic spectrum, roughly that chunk that enables you to see by sunlight and to detect ripe fruit and that sort of thing. So it's very evolutionarily determined. And you see things of a certain size quite easily because they're handy, right? So objects manifest themselves to you as things because they have some relationship to your capacity to use them as tools, and that's dependent on your size. You have a certain strength and not a different strength. You have a certain degree of articulation. There's some things you can represent in language. So you have limitations that screen out from your consideration all sorts of things. And that's bad because, for example, before people discovered germs, there was a lot of them zipping about killing people, and the fact that we couldn't see them wasn't such a good thing. But by the same token, we're also not as overwhelmed with complexity as we might be if we could detect everything. And you know, one of the problems with being connected so much is that it's easy to drown in information. And that's rough for information foragers. You can't stay off your damn computer because there's, you know, it opens up your senses far beyond their normal limitations. And so where should you stop? Well, you don't. You know, you're on the damn thing like a pensioner on a slot machine, and for many of the same reasons. So your body also filters out the world for you and provides you with access to some information and not access to others. And then the same thing is the case with your nervous system. And I put the first picture there of this is the central nervous system that controls voluntary movement, for example. I put it there because people like to think that their brain is in their head, but it's a stupid way of thinking about it as far as I'm concerned, because you have an awful lot of neurological tissue distributed through your body. And like your autonomic nervous system, if I remember correctly, which is mostly distributed through your body, has more neurons in it than your central nervous system. And so you aren't a brain in a body. You know, your brain is really distributed through your whole body. And I think the idea that you have a brain in a body is kind of a holdover from the idea that you have a soul in a body. and not that I'm necessarily criticizing that idea, but I think they kind of got grafted onto one another. And so, but the problem with that is that and this is that, so it's the soul body, brain body, mind body dichotomy, which I think is the same dichotomy. And the problem with that is that it's easy to think of thought as something that's abstracted away from the body. And I think that was an Enlightenment idea, you know, that just like the soul shouldn't be contaminated by the demands of the body if you were going to be pure spiritually, so your thought shouldn't be contaminated by your subjectivity and your emotions and your motivations and all of that. Your abstractions should be independent of your subjectivity. And rationality and emotion are construed in that manner as enemies. You know, that the purpose of rationality is to dispense with the irrationality of emotion and motivation. And that's Freud's idea of the properly functioning ego is something like that too, because the id is this place of compulsion and drive, and the ego has to basically suppress that in the service of the superego. There's no idea of integration really in Freud. Now, I don't want to be rough on Freud, and I think part of the reason that he thought that way is because the patients he had were precisely those who weren't very well integrated because of their pathological past, and so they didn't know how to get those subsystems up into the overarching game, and so their only alternative was something like suppression or repression. Because if you don't know how to be aggressive in a sophisticated way, you're still going to be aggressive, but you're going to have to inhibit it, control yourself, because you can't just be aggressive around people. It just won't go well for you. So even if you can't do it in a sophisticated way, you're going to repress it, or you're going to get in trouble. Those are the options. So, okay, but if you start thinking about the brain, the nervous system as part of the body, as an inseparable part, well then the function of thinking starts to become something different. It's not so much the objective, abstract representation of the world, which is kind of what you're pursuing if you're a scientist. It's more like conceptualization of and practice of the proper way of being in the world. And I think that's what you're more interested in anyways. I don't see how you can't be, since you're a living thing and you're overwhelmingly motivated to successfully manifest those actions that a living thing has to manifest in order to continue. And it's complicated. Like, you can boil it down to survival and reproduction. It's a good overarching simplification, but there's nothing simple about survival and reproduction. I mean, all sorts of complex monsters emerge out of that, even simple conceptualization. But it's not unreasonable to assume that one of the things that people generally want to do is to continue living in as pain-free manner as possible. It's something like that, although that's a simplification. So now the reason I'm making that case is because the fact that you have a body and yet the fact that you have a nervous system is another set of limitations on how it is that you're going to interact with the world. Okay, so now we've got the nervous system. We can go to higher resolution. We say, well, you have a brain. And the brain, let's see if I can, so that's the prefrontal, that's the frontal cortex there. And that's the temporal cortex there, and that's the parietal cortex there, and that's the sensory cortex there. And these were, if I remember properly, these were divisions that I think were first, well, they were first thought through in the late 19th and early 20th century. They're slightly specialized. So this cortex back here does a lot of the elaboration of vision, and that one there helps you with your sense of embodiment and your knowledge about where your body actually happens to be localized. And then that one helps, for example, in some elements of language output. And then the frontal cortex, especially the prefrontal part, which is up here, is concerned with the organization and the organization of motor action. And that's a good way of thinking about it. You've got part of your brain that deals with the sensory world, and in the integration of the sensory world, which seems to happen about there, where these places meet. And the prefrontal cortex, it grew out of the motor cortex. The motor cortex helps you plan voluntary actions. The prefrontal cortex grew out of that in the course of evolution. So you might think, well, there's reflex actions, and they happen when something happens to you, you respond. And then that elaborates up into the motor system, and that enables you to act voluntarily in the world. And then that elaborates up into the prefrontal motor system, which helps you plan how you might act in the world. Right? So it's the prefrontal cortex that's the home of, let's call it complex, sophisticated, voluntary thought, which you could think about as a way of representing the world, but which is more accurately a way of generating avatars of yourself in hypothetical worlds to figure out how they would survive if you did implement them into action. And so I think that's why. So one of the weird things that you discover psychometrically is that there's no correlation between conscientiousness and intelligence. And that's a weird one, you know, because people think about intelligence as planning and forward thinking and all of that, but that's also how they think about conscientiousness, as planful behavior and the consideration of future possibilities. But intelligence and conscientiousness have zero correlation. And so you think, well, why is that? Well, I guess it has to be that way, because you couldn't think abstractly if you were prone to act out what you thought. You just go and act it out. And that, like, I mentioned this to you before, when you dream, you're paralyzed. And you can take that little part of the brain that produces that paralysis out of a cat, or out of a person, but we haven't done it with people, out of a cat. And then when the cat falls asleep and hits REM sleep, it'll run around until it runs into something, and then it'll wake up. Well, so the dream thinking is so tightly allied with action that there's no separation between them. So there's no real abstraction there. If you couldn't abstract, you wouldn't be able to think. And the fact that you can abstract means that you can separate your thinking from your action. So that's why, as far as I can tell, there's very little correlation between conscientiousness and intelligence. It's like it has to be that way, because you have to be able to think about things that you wouldn't do if you're going to think. So, and generally we think of people who act as soon as they think as impulsive. So, okay, well, so there's a huge part of the brain that's devoted to sensory processing, and there's a huge part of the brain that's devoted to planning, and the whole prefrontal part of the brain is devoted to planning. And that's, and again, so what that indicates is that in large part, as far as your evolved body is concerned, the reason is that you think is so that you can act better. And of course that makes sense, and you can think about memory from that perspective too, because if you think scientifically, you think that your memory of the world is something like an objective record of events, but it's really not very much like that at all. And besides, who cares? You don't need an accurate representation of all the facts about this room. In fact, all it would do is weigh you down. Who cares what color the walls are, or what color the ceiling is, or what color the paint is? All of that's not worth remembering, partly because it has no relationship whatsoever to what you need to do in order to continue to act. And so what you're doing when you remember, as far as I can tell, is that you're mining your experience for information that you can bring forward into the future. It's purely pragmatic. And so, you know, I treat people who have post-traumatic disorder or symptoms of post-traumatic disorder. And so let's say they got post-traumatic stress disorder because, again, because a relationship collapsed on them suddenly, which is quite common. You know, they get betrayed or someone leaves them suddenly, and then they don't know what to do, because, especially if they're conscientious, because then they just tear themselves into pieces trying to figure out what they did wrong to bring about that event. And the reason they're doing that is because they want to retool their perceptions and their actions so that the probability that they'll have the same experience again is minimized. And their mind won't leave them alone until they do it. And no wonder, right? Because if you fall into a big pit and you get really hurt, the first thing you should figure out is how to not fall into big pits anymore. And your mind is set up exactly for that. And so what you do with someone who's having problems like that, so maybe they're waking up at the middle of the night obsessing about what went wrong, is you walk them through it. You do a situational analysis first, because one of the oversimplifications that people make, and this is especially true for conscientious people, is if something bad happened to me, I must have done something to deserve it. Now that's actually a pretty functional idea, because it suggests that there are things about your behavior that you could change that would make the future better. But the problem is that, say if it's the collapse of a relationship and you've been with that person for 8 years or longer, well, you did so many things with them that the idea that you did something wrong pretty much extends to every single thing you ever did with them. And that's, how are you going to fix that? And so that's part of the trauma, actually. The trauma is 80 million snakes all at the same time. It's like, well, forget it. You don't have time to go through all that material. And so partly what you do is with people, and this is what you should do with yourself too, is you do a situational analysis. It's like, don't be assuming necessarily that the thing that happened to you only happened to you because of what you did or didn't do. There's all sorts of factors at play. So one of the things that sometimes I do with clients is, if they were in a relationship and I can get some reasonable personality information about both of them, I can point out where they were temperamentally incompatible. You know, like if you're a highly conscientious person and your partner is very, very low in conscientiousness, it's like, well, good luck to you two. How the hell are you ever going to work that out? Because you want everything to be exactly where it's supposed to be, and you're working all the time, and your partner could care less whether things were where they're supposed to be, and they're not going to work. And you can butt heads about that forever. The probability that you're going to shift it, you know, except to some minor degree, is very, very low. And so sometimes you end up with someone with whom you get along very well on one temperamental dimension, and you're an absolute catastrophe on the other 4. And the probability that you're going to be able to mediate a huge temperamental difference is extremely low. You wouldn't expect yourself to mediate a huge intellectual difference, right? You're going to make the other person smarter, or maybe you smarter, depending on who you're with. It's like, no, probably not. A bit, maybe. So you do a situational analysis. And so what you're trying to do is to extract out information from your past and your present that will enable you to conduct yourself properly into the future. And so that's another example of the pragmatic element of thought. Well then, within the brain itself, apart from the major subdivisions which we just described, there are minor subdivisions, and here's a bunch of them listed: the caudate nucleus, the cerebral cortex, a huge newest part of the brain that's about a square meter. If you unfold it, it's all folded up, and most of the processing occurs right on the surface. That's the idea anyways. The thalamus, that's a place where a lot of the information in the brain appears to be integrated. The cerebellum helps you with balance and the sequencing of complex motor activities. The hippocampus, that's the one we talked about before. One of the things that the hippocampus seems to do is compare your model of the world as it's unfolding with the model that you desire to be occurring, and then keeps track of mismatches. And if it detects a mismatch, then it disinhibits other emotional and motivational centers. And that's the beginning of your response to the unknown. So one of them is the hypothalamus. I'm going to concentrate on it for a bit. It's a little tiny part of the brain that's pretty much at the top of the spinal cord. See, it's really small compared to the rest of the brain. Now, it turns out that imagine this is a cat brain for a minute, and you take off the whole cat brain, except for the hypothalamus, which people do. You take off the whole cortex, for example. And then the cat's still alive if you do it carefully, but it doesn't have much of a brain, and so you might think, well, that cat would just do nothing. But cat's actually pretty functional if it's reduced just to its hypothalamus. And that's because the hypothalamus is an incredibly important part of the brain, and it provides what I would say constitute the major frames, the major psychological frames. And so like a decorticate cat can still eat and drink and regulate its body temperature and engage in defensive aggression. And if it's female, it can still mate. Male can't, because the male mating behavior is more complicated. And as long as you keep it in a bounded environment, it can function reasonably well. It's hyper curious though, which is very weird, because you wouldn't expect a cat with no brain to be curious about anything, but a cat with no brain is curious about everything. And that seems to be because part of the reason that you aren't curious about something anymore is because you've investigated it, and you've built a representation of it that's functional, and that functional representation then stands for the thing itself, and then you can ignore it. And so you learn to ignore things. They're interesting to begin with, and then you learn to ignore them. And so one of the things that I think artists do, if they're great artists, is remind you that there's more to things than you see now that you've learned to ignore them. So you get a kind of a hallucinogenic painting of flowers like Van Gogh might produce, like his famous irises, which I think sold for like $220 million or something outrageous. It's like what Van Gogh is trying to show you is what those flowers looked like before you thought you could see them, because now you flower and you walk by, you know. You don't see it at all because you're off to get a peanut butter sandwich or something. You don't have time to glory in the wonder of the world, you know. You've got something practical to do. So, all right, so we're going to zoom in on the hypothalamus here. And what you see, of course, when you zoom in on the hypothalamus is that it's not a thing. It's a whole bunch of things, and then it's one of those horrible whole bunches of things that are made out of even more bunches of things, and they're made out of more bunches of things. And what's really interesting about going down the body from an analytic perspective is it doesn't seem to get less complex as you go farther down, you know, like some of the, I should actually show you that. I haven't showed you that little video of DNA fixing itself, eh? Oh, I better show you that. It's so cool. It's ridiculously cool, so you definitely need to see it.
Until I encountered the artworks of David Goodsell, who is a molecular biologist at the Scripps Institute. And his pictures are all, everything's accurate, it's all to scale. And his work illuminated for me what the molecular world inside us is like. So this is a transection through blood. In the top left-hand corner, you've got this yellow-green area. The yellow-green area is the fluids of blood, which is mostly water, but it's also antibodies, sugars, hormones, that kind of thing. And the red region is a slice into a red blood cell, and those red molecules are hemoglobin. They are actually red. That's what gives blood its color. And hemoglobin acts as a molecular sponge to soak up the oxygen in your lungs and then carry it to other parts of the body. I was very much inspired by this image many years ago, and I wondered whether we could use computer graphics to represent the molecular world. What would it look like? And that's how I really began. So let's begin. This is DNA in its classic double helix form, and it's from X-ray crystallography, so it's an accurate model of DNA. If we unwind the double helix and unzip the two strands, you see these things that look like teeth. Those are the letters of genetic code, the 25,000 genes you've got written in your DNA. This is what they typically talk about, the genetic code. This is what they're talking about. But I want to talk about a different aspect of DNA science, and that is the physical nature of DNA. And it's these two strands that run in opposite directions for reasons I can't go into right now, but they physically run in opposite directions, which creates a number of complications for your living cells, as you're about to see, most particularly when DNA is being copied. And so what I'm about to show you is an accurate representation of the actual DNA replication machine that's occurring right now inside your body, at least 2002 biology. So DNA is entering the production line from the left-hand side, and it hits this collection, this miniature biochemical machines that are pulling apart the DNA strand and making an exact copy. So DNA comes in and hits this blue donut-shaped structure, and it's ripped apart into its two strands. One strand can be copied directly, and it can be seen spooling off down to the bottom there. But things aren't so simple for the other strand because it must be copied backwards. So it's thrown out repeatedly in these loops and copied one section at a time, creating two new DNA molecules. Now, you have billions of this machine right now whirring away inside you, copying your DNA with exquisite fidelity. It's an accurate representation, and it's pretty much at the correct speed for what is occurring inside you. But I've left out error correction and a bunch of other things. This was work from a number of years ago. Thank you. This is work from a number of years ago, but what I want to show you next is updated science. It's updated technology. So again, we begin with DNA, and it's jiggling and wiggling there because of the surrounding soup of molecules, which I've stripped away so you can see something. DNA is about 2 nanometers across, which is really quite tiny. But in each one of your cells, each strand of DNA is about 30 to 40 million nanometers long. So to keep the DNA organized, to regulate access to the genetic code, it's wrapped around these purple proteins. I've labeled them purple here. It's packaged up and bundled up. All of this field of view is a single strand of DNA. This huge package of DNA is called a chromosome, and we'll come back to chromosomes in a minute. We're pulling out, we're zooming out through a nuclear pore, which is sort of the gateway to this compartment that holds all the DNA called the nucleus. All of this field of view is about a semester's worth of biology, and I've got 7 minutes, so we're not going to be able to do that today. No, I'm being told no. This is the way a living cell looks down a light microscope, and it's been filmed under time lapse, which is why you can see it moving. The nuclear envelope breaks down. These sausage-shaped things are the chromosomes, and we'll focus on them. They go through this very striking motion that is focused on these little red spots. When the cell feels it's ready to go, it rips apart the chromosome. One set of DNA goes to one side, the other side gets the other set of DNA, identical copies of DNA, and then the cell splits down the middle. And again, you have billions of cells undergoing this process right now inside of you. Now we're going to rewind and just focus on the chromosomes and look at its structure and describe it. So again, here we are at that equator moment. The chromosomes line up, and if we isolate just one chromosome, we're going to pull it out and have a look at its structure. So this is one of the biggest molecular structures that you have, at least as far as we've discovered so far, inside of us. So this is a single chromosome, and you have 2 strands of DNA in each chromosome. One is bundled up into one sausage. The other strand is bundled up into the other sausage. These things that look like whiskers that are sticking out from either side are the dynamic scaffolding of the cell. They're called microtubules, but name's not so important. But what we're going to focus on is this red region. I've labeled it red here. And it's the interface between the dynamic scaffolding and the chromosomes. It is obviously central to the movement of the chromosomes, but we have no idea really, as to how it's achieving that movement. We've been studying this thing called the kinetochore for over 100 years with intense study, and we're still just beginning to discover what it's all about. It is made up of about 200 different types of proteins, thousands of proteins in total. It is a signal broadcasting system. It broadcasts through chemical signals, telling the rest of the cell when it's ready, when it feels that everything is aligned and ready to go for the separation of the chromosomes. It is able to couple onto the growing and shrinking microtubules. It's transiently, it's involved with the growing of the microtubules, and it's able to transiently couple onto them. It's also a tension sensing system. It's able to feel when the cell is ready, when the chromosome is correctly positioned. It's turning green here because it feels that everything is just right. And you'll see that there's one little last bit that's still remaining red, and it's walked away down the microtubules. That is the signal broadcasting system sending out the stop signal, and it's walked away. I mean, it's that mechanical. It's molecular clockwork. This is how you work at the molecular scale. So with a little bit of molecular eye candy, we've got kinesins, which are the orange ones. They're little molecular courier molecules walking one way. And here are the dynein. They're carrying that broadcasting system, and they've got their long legs so they can step around obstacles and so on. So again, this is all derived accurately from the science. The problem is we can't show it to you any other way. Exploring at the frontier of science, at the frontier of human understanding, is mind-blowing. Discovering this stuff is certainly a pleasurable incentive to work in science. But most medical researchers, this is just discovering this stuff is simply steps along the path to the big goals, which are to eradicate disease, to eliminate the suffering and the misery that disease causes, and to lift people out of poverty. Thank you.
So, like, that's just so ridiculously mind-blowing that it's almost unbearable. I mean, to think about that as clockwork even is a pretty strange idea, because, well, those little things walk over obstacles. It's like, how the hell does that happen? They're just molecules. So it's so cool, because when you go down, you'd think simple, but, you know. And, you know, he said at the beginning when they were taking that, when the little machines were taking that DNA apart, that he didn't show the error correcting. You know, there's other little machines that go along and see if everything's okay, and if it isn't, they cut it out and put a right piece in. It's like, yeah, things we don't understand. There's no shortage of them, that's for sure. Okay, so what I'm doing in some sense is walking you through a psychophysiological or representation of Piaget's developmental process, I would say. So I wanted to zero in on the hypothalamus because it seems to me the thing that sets the most basic frames. And so we'll go ahead with that. So you see that it's made up of all these little parts. And so it's called the hypothalamus more for convenience than because it's a homogeneous set of structures, because it's not a homogeneous set of structures. And this is something to consider very carefully when you're thinking about the terminology that psychologists use or that you might use to describe your own behavior. because you know, you can roughly, there is a psychology of motivation and there's a psychology of emotion, and you might think, well, emotion and motivation are categorically different entities, but they're not. In fact, there's no such thing as a uniform set of motivations, and there's no such thing as a uniform set of emotions, and the distinction between a motivation and an emotion is unclear, to say the least. And that's partly because the physiological substructures that subsume what we call motivations and what we call emotions, and it's not like there's a motivation center that's homogeneous. The closest is the hypothalamus, but it's made of structures that are qualitatively different. And then the emotions, because I have to use that descriptive terminology because we have to communicate about it somehow. There's all sorts of different structures in the brain that contribute to emotional expression, and they're not even in the same place, much less composed of identical structure or function. So you know, we have these shorthands that we use to divide up the world, but they're awkward and untenable as the level of resolution increases. But anyways, I'm still going to go with motivation and emotion because it's a useful simplification, but you can see with the hypothalamus that there's all these, you know, complicated little subsystems in there, and then I showed you that video to show you just how complicated the subsystems are, all the way down to the, really to the molecular level. How those little machines manage what they do is completely beyond me. You know, to call it clockwork when those little things that walk can walk over obstacles, it's like clockwork does one thing, you know, only. Click, 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 that's all it does. No exceptions. This thing walks over obstacles to get where it's going. It's like, who knows what's going on down there. But it works well enough, so here we are, weirdly enough. So, motivation seems to me to be the initial framing process. And you come into the world with the motivational systems roughly ready to go. You know, babies are hungry, babies get cold, babies want something to drink. You know, so the world already comes, in some sense, they come into the world with pre-packaged categories for existence, and those are the categories that are going to aid their survival. And you know, they're not simple either. It's not so simple. It's, well, hunger, thirst, pleasure, pain, anxiety, you know, the classic sort of, and the classic emotions, sadness, joy, and so forth. Those systems are already there, but babies have more complicated systems too, like the system for exploration is already in place, and the system for play, which is really complicated, it's already in place. And so, you know, you come into the world with a human nature, and the nature seems to be distributed across these subsystems. That's one way of thinking about it. And it's also useful to think about the operation of those subsystems as something like, you could think about them as games with an aim. You could think about them as stories. You could think about them as frames of reference. You can think about them as action patterns. All of those, and you can think about them as sub-personalities, which I actually think is maybe the best way to think about them. Because if you're hungry, it's not a deterministic drive. It's a sub-personality that has a goal, and then it has a bunch of action patterns that are going to work in reference to that goal. It has a bunch of perceptions that suit that goal, and it organizes your emotional responses around that goal. And so to think about it as a personality is it's a much more intelligent way to look at it. One other thing about Skinner's rats, you know, Skinner could get rats to do almost everything, and he would reward them with food. And so he had a simple rat model, but his rats were starved down to 75% of their normal body weight. So not only were they not social, gregarious rats like rats are, because they were isolated, they were genetically altered from wild rats, but they also weren't as complex as a real rat because they were starving. And so, but you know, a starving rat is a pretty good model of a rat, and a rat is a pretty good model of a person. But a lot of our models of simple behavioral learning were based on starving, isolated rats. So, anyways, how to think about motivation? We'll think about it from the hypothalamic perspective. So we could say one thing that motivation does is set goals. We could say that emotions track progress towards goals. And I'm going to use that schema even though it's not exactly right. So you say, well, motivation determines where you're going to aim. So if you're hungry, you're going to aim at something to eat. And then that will organize your perceptions so that you zero out everything that isn't relevant to that task, which is almost everything. You concentrate on those few things that are going to facilitate your movement forward. When you encounter those things, that produces positive emotion as you move through the world towards your goal, and you see that things are laying themselves out that facilitate your movement forward. Those things cause positive emotion. And if you encounter anything that gets in the way, then that produces negative emotion, and it can be like threat, because you're not supposed to encounter something that gets in the way. It can be anger, so that you move it away. It can be frustration, disappointment, grief. Those would, if you had a response that serious to an obstacle, it would probably punish the little motivated frame right out of existence. You know, so you walk downstairs and, I don't know, the contracting company has set a wrecking ball through your kitchen. It's like, that's going to be disappointing. You're not going to keep eating the peanut butter sandwich in the rubble. That little frame is going to get punished out of existence, and some new goal is going to pop up in its stead. And you know, one of the things we're going to try to sort out is, how do you decide when you've encountered an obstacle that's so big that you should just quit and go do something else? Because that's not obvious. You know, and you can get into counterproductive persistence pretty easily. So we don't know how people solve that problem. It's a really complicated one. So anyways, we're going to work on that scenario. Your hypothalamus pops up micro goals that are directly relevant to biological survival. That produces a frame of reference. So it's not a goal, it's not a drive, and it's not a collection of behaviors. It's a little personality. And the personality has a viewpoint, it has thoughts that go along with it. It has perceptions, it has action tendencies, all of that. You can see this in addiction, most particularly. So one of the things that you find often with people who are alcoholic is they lie all the time. And that's because when they've built a little alcohol-dependent personality inside of themselves, or a big one, maybe it's 90% of their personality, and one of the things that consists of is all the rationalizations that they've used over the years to justify their addiction to themselves and to other people. And so the addiction has a personality. You know, and so when the person is off, or maybe they're addicted to meth or something like that, where, you know, the addiction is more, it's more short-term powerful, than I would say, than an alcohol addiction. They'll say anything. And the words are just tools used to get towards the goal. And if they happen to be deceptive, whatever, it doesn't matter. They're just practical tools to get towards the goal. And then when you get towards the goal and you take a nice shot of meth or something like that, you reinforce all those rationales that you used to get the drug, and then the next time you're even a better deceiver and liar. So, okay, so we're going to say motivations, one way of thinking about it is they set goals, but it's not the right way of thinking about it. They produce a whole framework of interpretation. And so we're going to think about that framework of interpretation. And then emotions emerge inside of that. So that's it. So the world is framed, motivation set goals. You could say the world has to be framed. So motivation sets that frame, goals, emotions, perceptions, and actions. And then actions track progress. So positive emotion says you're moving forward properly towards your goal. And if you encounter something you don't expect, you stop. That's anxiety. It's like, oh, we're not where we thought we were. And so we don't know what to do. So we should stop, because we don't know where we are or what we're doing. Stop, frozen. And then the more powerful negative emotions like pain, they might make you get out of there. So emotions, forward, stop, reverse. That's your emotions within that motivated frame. So, and that's another example of how your mind is embedded in your body. Your emotions are like they're offshoots of action tendencies. That's the right way to think about it, because action is everything fundamentally. So what are some basic motivations? Most of these are regulated by the hypothalamus, by the way, and that tells you just how important a control system it is. The other thing that's useful to know about the hypothalamus is that it has projections going up from it that are like tree trunks, and inhibitory projections coming down that are like grapevines. So you can kind of control your hypothalamus as long as it's not on too much, but if it's on in any serious way, it's like it wins. So partly what you do to stop yourself from falling under the dominion of your hypothalamus is to never ever be anywhere where its action is necessary, right? You don't want to go into a biker bar, because you might find yourself in a situation where panicked defensive aggression is immediately necessary. You probably don't want that. You don't want the panic, you don't want the terror, you don't want the frenzied fight, you don't want any of that. You don't want to have to run away in absolute panic. So you just don't go there. And a huge part of how we regulate our emotions is just by never going anywhere where we have to experience them. And so that has very little to do with internal inhibitory control, and everything to do with staying where you belong. So, okay. So, basic motivations: hunger, thirst, pain. Pain is not regulated by the hypothalamus. That's a different circuit. Anger / aggression, thermoregulation, panic and escape, affiliation and care, sexual desire, exploration, play. And you can kind of break those in. You can kind of break those into the classic Darwinian categories too, and say, well, there's a set of motivations that go along with self-maintenance. That'd be your survival. Ingestive and defensive. See, I've sort of coded them there. So the self-maintenance, there's an ingestive set of basic motivations that go with self-maintenance. You say that's hunger, thirst. There's a set of defensive motivations: pain, anger, thermoregulation, panic and escape. And then there's motivations that are associated with reproduction: affiliation, care, and sexual desire. And then I put exploration and play sort of outside of that. I would say because those two things serve both of these approximately equally. So what I tried to do is take the basic motivations and then nest them inside a fundamental Darwinian framework so that you could see how the biological process of evolution has manifested itself and then sort of differentiated into these fundamental biological systems. So, okay, so this is a rat brain flat map. And so it's basically what you would see of a rat's brain if you flattened it out, unrolled it, flattened it out, and then made it two-dimensional. And you can see here, so this is the hypothalamus. And you can see that it's made out of these different nuclei. That's what they're called. And they sort of correspond to those shapes that I showed you in the human hypothalamus earlier. And you see that there's different systems. There's the system for eating and drinking is outlined in green. And the reproductive system, there's two of them, and they're outlined in I think it's red. Is that right? Yeah, reproductive is red, and the defensive ones are in magenta. And so those are you could think about those as the three fundamental value systems of living creatures with complex nervous systems as far as the hypothalamus is concerned. And then given what I told you about the hypothalamus, which is you hardly need the rest of your brain at all as long as you have a hypothalamus, it's worth thinking that those are very fundamental to value per se. Now, you might think if you only need the damn hypothalamus, why bother with the rest of the brain at all? That's a very useful question, especially because most creatures don't have much of a brain. So, but it seems to be something like, well, you've got your eating and drinking system, your reproductive system, and your defensive system, but the problem is that those things, first of all, can conflict. You know, are you too hungry to sleep or too sleepy to eat? So that's a pretty simple kind of contradiction, you know. Are you more angry at your partner, or do you want sexual relations more? So so they can conflict in the present, but then they can conflict with other people doing the same thing, and they can conflict across time. And so partly the reason that you need the rest of your brain is to solve the problems that emerge from the solutions that the hypothalamus offers. And so because you don't want to just eat and drink and reproduce and defend yourself, you want to eat now, later, tomorrow, next week, and next month, while you're able to engage in reproductive activity and defend yourself in multiple contexts with a whole bunch of people for as long as you can possibly manage it. And so you need the rest of your brain to calculate that. And so what the rest of your brain has to do, roughly speaking, is regulate these and also elaborate them up into like into something that's integrated inside you, which might roughly be your personality, and then so that that personality is integrated with the personality of other people. And so you can think about it as an emergent process. This is one of the things I really like about Piaget. He's so damn smart because Piaget is the only thinker I know, really, who really addressed the problem of the evolution of value systems. Like, he never nailed it down to the physiology because there wasn't enough known about physiology when he did his work. But it maps really nicely onto the physiology. But, you know, he said, well, but he got it right anyways. He said, you come into the world with a handful of pre-established reflexes. Okay, we're going to complicate that up a bit. No, you come into the world with a handful of micro-personalities that are centered around these fundamental motivational axes. Okay, and then that gets you started. And that has motor output as well as perceptions and all of that that's associated with it. And then as you interact initially, let's say with your mother, you start to learn how to integrate those things in some sort of social context, because you form a relationship with your mother right off the bat. And so you're starting to figure out how to produce patterned and stable interactions between those motivational systems on a day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month basis. And one of the things you do with kids, it's really important to do this with kids, is you want to get them onto some sort of a routine. Because what the routine is actually is the beginnings of the system that integrates all of these underlying biological systems into some sort of unity. Because they have to sleep and wake up. So you want to nail that down so it's predictable. You know, they have to eat, they have to stay warm, and they need to do that in a manner that's stable. And so it's to your great benefit as a parent that you get islands of stability planted in the life of your kid, so that some of this gets simplified, so that the kid isn't constantly preoccupied with domination by these different motivational systems. And so it's a useful thing to know, because you might think, well, you don't want to impose any structure on your baby. It's like, no, wrong. You don't want to be a tyrant about it, but there's no difference between that structure and the emergence of the child's adaptation to the world. And to some degree, what you're trying to do is free them up from arbitrary domination by these underlying motivational systems. You know, because if a baby gets too tired, it's a horrible little thing. It'll just scream at you non-stop, and it's not happy about it. It's like, it's not good for anyone for that to happen. And so the faster, you have to do it in relationship with the child. I mean, some will sleep right away in a schedule almost immediately, and other kids are harder to get their circadian rhythms regulated. So you have to attend to the individual differences that characterize the child, but you're still trying to establish some stable harmony out of this mishmash of initial systems. So, all right, so that's sort of a physiological look at it. This is more of a conceptual look at it. So I said that each of these systems you can think about in a bunch of different ways. You can think about it as something that sets a goal. I'm hungry and I don't want to be hungry. Point A, point B. So the hunger and the vision of the satiation of the hunger are all part of the same frame. And so if you're hungry, you go into the kitchen. You know that already. That's part of your procedural knowledge about how the world works. And then what you're going to look for are only those things that are relevant to what you're trying to do in the kitchen. Everything else is zeroed out. You won't even really see it. And why would you? You want to see the things that are relevant to the task at hand. And so that's the thing that's so cool, I think, because what it means is that you see the things that are relevant to the task at hand. And so here's something to think about. Let's say that you see a whole bunch of things in the world that you don't want to see, you know, that make you constantly miserable and unhappy. One thing you might ask yourself is, are you sure that your goals are proper? Because your goals determine what you see. Now, not 100%, obviously. You can be thinking about the homework you're going to do and step off a curb and be hit by a van. It's like you're going to get hit by the van regardless of how you've oriented your perceptions, likely, in all likelihood. So I'm not trying to argue for pure solipsism, but it is very interesting to consider that since you see in relationship to what you want, that a very large amount of what you see is dependent on what you're aiming at. And so one issue is, if your life is wretched and miserable, one thing to think about is whether or not what you're aiming at is the right thing to be aiming at. And nothing is exactly the wrong answer to that. I'm aiming at nothing. So okay, you're going to experience a tremendous amount of misery and not very much joy. So anyways, you've got this little frame. You're somewhere, and it's not good enough. And you're going somewhere else that's going to be better. And what better depends upon is the state of these underlying biological systems. And then more complexly, as those biological systems get integrated into a personality and into the social world, then the frame and the goal is going to be dependent on that more complex hierarchical organization. So you're not in here because you're hungry. You're in here because if you get a degree, maybe you don't ever have to be hungry. So the hunger is properly incorporated into your, you don't want to be cold, you don't want to freeze to death in the winter, you don't want to be on the street. You know, so your higher order goals are long-term, socially negotiated solutions to the problems that are implicit in your being. That might be one way of thinking about it. And the micro elements of this, so you could say I'm hungry, that's a physiological state and a conception. I have a vision of how I'm going to solve that, but then, and that's an abstraction. But what you do to transform point A into point B is not an abstraction. You act. You know, so if you're hungry, you actually move your body, say down from the second floor into the kitchen, and you arrange things so that there's transformations in the world. And that's a good way of thinking about the relationship between the mind and the body. Your hypothetical solution to your problem, that's the mind. But the manner in which you incarnate that solution, that's no longer abstract. So, you know, people are always trying to solve the mind-body problem. And that's, as far as I can tell, that's how you solve it, is you have abstractions, but they're not abstractions that are representations of the world. They're abstractions that are representations of action patterns. And the way those are implemented in the world is that you act them. And so it's strange because you've got this weird level of control, you know. I can move my arm, and I seem to be able to do that voluntarily, but I really have no idea how I'm doing it. Like, I don't have conscious access exactly to the musculature, except technically, and I certainly have no idea what I'm doing chemically to make those muscles transform. But my abstractions ground out in this movement, and I can observe the movement and modify it, but I have no conscious access whatsoever to the microprocesses that are making that possible. I have no idea why that is. Probably because I'm not smart enough. That would be my guess, right? Is you're only going to, evolution is only going to allow your mind to control those elements of your being that you're smart enough to control. And so you don't get voluntary control over your heartbeat, for example, because you just forget, and then you'd be wandering around, and then you'd forget to beat your heart, and bang, you'd be dead. So you don't get to do that. So, all right, so all these different, I classified these again as self-propagation and self-maintenance motivations. And so if you're too hot, well, you want to go somewhere cooler, and if you're too cool, you want to go somewhere hotter. And same if you're thirsty and hungry. And for self-propagation, well, you get lonesome, and maybe, you know, you have some sexual desire, and each of those different systems competes for access to this central frame, and that's something like the contents of your consciousness at any given time. So up pops a desire, but it's the wrong way of thinking about it, because a desire sounds like something that's pushing you forward, but the desire is goal, framework, emotion, perception, action, pattern, all at the same time. It's a little personality, or it's a little story. Actually, when you describe the operation of one of these things, that's when you're telling a story. So I was somewhere, I needed something, I went and got it. It's a boring little story, but that's the basic unit of a story, right? Because I don't care to hear what you're doing unless you had a reason for doing it. I just say, what's the point of the story? And the point of the story is the point. It's directional, right? It says, I went from here to there, that's the point. Here's how I did it, that's the point. And you're interested in that because maybe you want to know how to do it too. And you won't have to struggle through it like I did. You could just listen. And so we're always throwing these little units of information back and forth to each other. And for good reason. I want to know what your point is. Because better I learn it from you than make all the mistakes that you had to make when you were learning it. And human beings, we got that figured out, that's for sure. So, okay, I'm going to just explain this, and then we'll stop. All right, so we're in one of those frames now, and we're going from point A to point B. And so the question is, how does the world lay itself out? Okay, so the first thing to understand, and this is partly the reason I showed you the gorilla video, is that the first thing a frame does for you is make almost everything irrelevant. And that's so great, because that's what you want. You want almost everything to be irrelevant, because otherwise you're going to be so flooded with information that that's what hallucinogens do, at least in their initial stages, is they take away that filter and make everything relevant. You can read about that in Huxley's Doors of Perception. He does a great job of describing the initial stages of a mescaline experience. And what happens is that all of the memory, in some sense, that regulates his perceptions is stripped off. And so he sees everything glowing and alive and magical, like he'd never encountered it before, which is exactly how you would see something if all your memory about it was gone. And so he sees things as way more complex and interesting than he normally sees them. Well, that's fine, but you know, if you're like that all the time, then you know, you end up in a ditch starving to death or something. Like it's not commensurate with normal life. That's what it looks like. And so your perceptions are just shrunk and restricted to the bare minimum necessary to keep you moving in the direction that you're moving. All right, so the first thing you want to do is you want to make things irrelevant. Now, if you're with someone in a relationship, partly what you want them to do is to help you continue making most of their possibility irrelevant. It's polite, because one of the things, so you say, well, we have a friendship, let's say, we have a friendship, okay? So that means you've agreed to act in a friendly manner towards me and to support me. There's all sorts of other ways you could act, like a myriad of them. And I'm going to do the same for you. So we're simpler to each other than we would normally be. And then you go and do something that betrays me. It's like, bang, that whole simplification is gone. And all those parts of you that were supposed to be irrelevant because we were playing the same game, they're dead relevant, and I don't know who the hell you are. And so that's really rough, and people do not like that. It's this emergent mismatch between their desires and the way the world is manifesting itself. So one of the issues of complexity is that when you hit an obstacle, everything that you have agreed with other people to make irrelevant is irrelevant. And that's generally a disconcerting experience. Now you can, you know, you might want to toy a little bit with that in a relationship, you know, so maybe you encourage your partner to dress differently, or you go do different things or something because you don't want to be stuck in exactly the same old rut. And so what you'll agree is how you can both deviate an interesting amount. But that's voluntary and controlled. It's not the same at all as having that little mess of 80 million snakes pop up right in front of you, which is the last thing you want to have happen. And so it's so weird, because one of the things that we're striving to do constantly is to keep most of the world irrelevant. And our cultural systems are designed precisely for that purpose. And part of what you do when you disrupt them is you force people to consider a far more range of relevance than they are even vaguely comfortable or vaguely competent to manage. And it just burns them to a crisp. Because what your body does is, if all of a sudden everything around you is irrelevant, like I could say, you're stripped naked, I take you in a helicopter, drop you right into the middle of a jungle at midnight. It's like, you're not bored. Standing there, frozen, paralyzed, everything is interesting. Well, too bad for you, because too interesting is very little different from terrifying. And so, you know, your heart rate's going to be at 160 for like 2 days, and then something will eat you and your problems will be over. So, all right, so this diagram basically suggests this is how you break up the world when you're going from point A to point B. It renders almost everything irrelevant. Hooray. And then what happens is the rest of the world is broken up into obstacles that get in your way and tools that facilitate your movement forward. And that's actually what you see when you come into a place. Like when you come into this room, these are obstacles insofar as you can't walk through them, and those are tools insofar as you can sit on them and watch the class. And this is a tool, and these are tools, and this is a tool, and I'm a tool for, although I'd never admit it, but anyways, I'm a tool because you need to take this class in order to advance towards your degree. And so basically what you see in the world are entities of functional significance, and those are not objects. They are not the same thing. So, and that's very much worth considering, because see, we're trying to build up a case, at least in part, for analyzing the nature of the structures within which you organize your perceptions. And we tend to think that those are predicated on object perception. It's not true. It's not true. They're predicated on relevance conception. Does it help you? Does it get in your way? Or is it irrelevant? That's what you want to know. If it helps you, you're happy about it. If it gets in your way, you're negatively predisposed towards it. If it's irrelevant, it's invisible. And so if your little scheme is functional, your little frame is functional, then most of the things that you encounter are mildly positive. And that's how you know that you know what you're doing. That's how you validate the entire frame. So, okay, good. So I guess the case that I was making last time, at least in part, was that one way of conceptualizing the fundamental problem that human beings face is to conceptualize it as an ongoing struggle with complexity. And complexity emerges as a consequence of the sort of finite boundedness of individual consciousness and the incredible excess of the unbounded everywhere else, even including underneath that consciousness, because of course your individual consciousness depends on the function, or is related to the function of things that are so complex you can't even understand it. So there you are, surrounded by some things that you understand in an ocean of things that you don't understand at all, and including things about yourself. And it's not obvious at all how people solve that problem, because in some sense it's not solvable, the fact that you don't have the cognitive resources or the conceptual resources to understand everything that you need to understand in order to properly orient yourself in the world. Now, obviously, partly the way we deal with that is that we cooperate with other people, and so that radically multiplies our resources, incredibly multiplies our resources. So, and it's something to consider always when, you know, so much of the political dialogue that surrounds us now consists of a critique of cooperative societies and an analysis of their oppressive nature. And of course that's true, because any cooperative system that specifies a certain endpoint and produces a value hierarchy of some sort also simultaneously forces things into that value system and then rank orders people according to the value structure. And so there's an oppressive element to it. But compared to being naked in chaos, generally it's better. Now, it doesn't always have to be, because it can get murderous, but generally speaking, well, look, we're social animals, it doesn't matter. Our evolutionary pathway has already taken us here, and so we're individuals, but we're unbelievably social, and so that's that. So as far as I can tell, we'd have to be completely different creatures not to take advantage of and fall prey to the problems with social being. All right, so I think the way that the problem of complexity has been solved, and this is the best argument I know of for the truth of the Darwinian notion of evolution. Now, I don't think that our models of evolution are complete by any stretch of the imagination. I know they're not, partly because of recent work done on epigenetics, which suggests that you can inherit acquired traits. Right? And when I went to university, when I started going to university in the 1980s, that was heresy, really. Like, no, you cannot inherit acquired traits, but actually you can inherit acquired traits. That's the field of epigenetics studies that. And that's a radical shift in perspective, because we also don't know exactly what that means across any length of time. And when you're thinking about evolutionary lengths of time, you're thinking about 3.5 billion years, because that's the span of time over which life evolved. And so even things that don't have a overwhelmingly marked potency for one generation can be unbelievably powerful across time. And then there's also the issue of sexual selection, because you know, you'll hear Darwinists continually describe the world and the evolutionary world as a place of randomness. And that's not true. And I don't know why they make that statement. The mutations are random or quasi-random, because we don't understand mutations that well yet either. And most mutations are deadly, right? Most mutations are deadly. There's a set of them that are harmful but not deadly. And then there's a tiny, tiny proportion that could, in principle, produce some benefit to the next generation, assuming environmental shift, say, in the direction of the mutation. So, and there's a randomness element to that. We know that. I mean, part of the reason that you mutate, or your cells mutate, your DNA mutates, is because of background levels of radioactivity. And a lot of that's a consequence of solar activity, right? So cosmic rays come zipping through the atmosphere and they nail your DNA and produce minor alterations, and that's a mutation. And If you crank up the background radiation rate, like say around Chernobyl, then the mutation rate rises, and there's definitely a random element to that. And it's necessary for there to be a random element because, as far as I can tell, the only way you can beat a random environment is by producing random changes, right? So, you know the idea, basically. The environment isn't some static place that's selecting for higher and higher levels of fitness, or not in any, it's certainly not doing that in any static way. And so it's shifting around randomly. And then, you know, you have a structure that's been, your species has a structure that's a consequence of this immense evolutionary journey, and it's moderating itself randomly within certain parameters, the parameters being that most mutations will kill you, like alterations in your fundamental form generally tend to kill you, so they're incremental. And so the mutations are random and they match, hopefully, they match the randomness in the environmental shift, and so you can more or less keep up that way. But then there's additional complicating factors, and they're not trivial. And one of them is whatever epigenetics does. We don't know anything about that yet. But the second one is sexual selection. And sexual selection is no joke. It could be the primary thing. It's certainly one of the primary things that's driven human evolution. And I think you can say that you think about the environment again. Well, let's think about the environment. So you have a dominance hierarchy, and that's really an old structure. The dominance hierarchy is 300 million years old, because it emerged pretty much whenever there was a nervous system, emergent nervous system, and whenever animals had to occupy the same territory, they automatically organized themselves into something approximating a dominance hierarchy. So it's a very, 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 very old structure. It's older than trees. It's older than flowers. It's old. And as far as real goes from a Darwinian sense, permanent is real. And so when you can say, well, you know, our arboreal ancestors adapted themselves to trees, and so the tree was around long enough to be a feature of the environment. But the dominance hierarchy has been around a lot longer than trees. And you can think of the dominance hierarchy both as an adaptation to the environment, because you'd kind of think about the dominance hierarchy as a cultural construct. But if a cultural construct lasts long enough, then it becomes part of the environment. And so the dominance hierarchy is part of the environment. And what seems to happen, roughly speaking, and this is an oversimplification, but we'll go with it, is that males have a dominance hierarchy, and there's a relatively small number of males that are relatively successful, and those successful males have preferential access to female reproductive capacity, either because the females actively choose the more dominant males, which is very, very common, or because the more dominant males chase all the less dominant males away, so that even if the females don't exercise choice, which they often do, then the only males left around that can serve as reasonable mating partners are the more powerful ones. And so you think you get two really radical determiners of evolution as a consequence of that. One is that each, I'm not talking about female dominance hierarchies at the moment, but I can talk about them, but that's why this is an oversimplification. But what happens is that the males obviously are selected for their ability to move up dominance hierarchies. Obviously, because the ones that are at the top of the dominance hierarchy reproduce preferentially. And so that means the male dominance hierarchy becomes a method of selection. But then allied with that is the female proclivity for choice on whatever dimension the dominance hierarchy happens to be arranged. And so then female sexual selection also becomes a radical, non-random selector of what genetic material is going to move into the next generation. And so I fail to see how any of that can be separated from the emergence of complex nervous systems and mind over the course of evolution, because creatures aren't making random choices. They're not random at all. So we even know such things like, imagine a peacock's tail, you know. And it's covered with eyes, which is quite interesting, because eyes, of course, attract attention. And lots of animals have evolved eye-like markings. Like moths, there's moths that, when they unfold their wings, they have two big eyes on the back of them. And that's to keep birds from eating them, right? Because the birds don't like being stared at, so they stay away from the moths. But so a peacock's tail is nothing but eyes. And so it's very attractive, and it shimmers. And there's something about it that's beautiful, which is quite interesting, too. The females have obviously been selecting the male peacocks for beauty. They have this insane tail. Well, so the evolutionary biologists have thought, well, what possible utility could that tail be? Is it just maybe the females got fixated on tail, so to speak, and you know, you got a Baldwin effect loop going there, and the male peacocks just got bigger and bigger tails, and it's just like an evolutionary dead end. It's, you know, it's a positive feedback system that's gone out of control. But they have done things that like look at the symmetry and breadth, say, or the symmetry and size and overall quality of the male peacock's tail as a marker for physical health. So reduced parasite load, for example. And it does turn out that the healthier male peacocks have better tail display. And so what the females seem to be doing is using some marker or some set of markers as a proxy indicator for health. And I think you could say reasonably that female human beings do the same thing to male human beings. And there's some of that vice versa too. Like we evaluate each other, for example, for symmetry, which is one of the elements of beauty, because healthier people tend to be more symmetrical. And lots of animals use symmetry. Butterflies, if butterflies won't mate with another butterfly, if it deviates from symmetry by the tiniest amounts you can imagine. So symmetry is a marker. And there's other markers, like shoulder width to waist width is one, and waist width to hip width is another. That's usually what males use that to evaluate females in part. So there's lots of markers of health. But it also looks to me like the data worldwide seems to indicate that women, so imagine that women mate across dominance hierarchies and up, socioeconomically speaking. And on average, across cultures, women go for men who are about 4 to 5 years older. You know, it varies. In the Scandinavian countries, that's shrunk a little bit, but not that much. And in other cultures, it's bigger. I would say that depends to some degree on difficulty of establishing economic independence, right? Because in richer countries, it's easier to have enough economic independence if you're a male to be a useful participant in the process of having children. But it doesn't matter. Cross-culturally, it's still across and up, where men mate across and down. They don't care much about socioeconomic status. It doesn't seem to be part of their selection method, generally speaking. So I think that part of that is also the ability of women to select for male health. It's something like that, because it isn't only that, because if you're healthy and energetic, you're much more likely to be successful, because it's very hard to be successful if you're ill, obviously. I mean, so because the competition is just too high. And both genders, both sexes select each other for attractiveness, both select for intelligence, both select for personality, although there are differences there in terms of what's stressed. But so I think you can derive a couple of things out of this, and this is where I think people are different than other animals. Importantly different is that, so you imagine that there's tremendous selection pressure towards the production, let's say, of men who are good at climbing male dominance hierarchies, or climbing the male dominance hierarchy. But the thing that's so interesting about people is that we've multiplied our dominance hierarchies. You know, if you take an animal that's got a rather static behavioral pattern, then there's a single hierarchy. Elephant seals are a good example of that. So elephant seals, the males are absolutely massive. They're way, way bigger than the females. And they basically have harems, roughly speaking. And they use physical prowess as their marker of status, essentially. And obviously size is a huge part of that, because otherwise the male elephant seals wouldn't be as, they're massive, these things. They're absolutely enormous. And so it's just power / health, you know, maybe aggression, something like that. It's whatever makes them more suitable for the kind of physical combat that elephant seals engage in. So, and the degree to which power is associated with dominance status in those sorts of situations seems to be associated with the size differential between males and females. So the more power is an issue with regards to male competence, the larger the males are compared to the females, and the more likely the males are going to have a harem relationship with the females. And you see that a little bit in human beings, because men are bigger than women. They're not overwhelmingly bigger, that's sexual dimorphism. And you know, there's some men that are smaller than some women, but on average men are taller and they have more upper body strength and so forth. So there is a power element to male competition, but it's not as extended as it would be among animals, say like elephant seals. So in the elephant seal, you see maybe there's one stable set of traits that's being selected for. that makes the males more likely to reproduce. But human beings, we're very weird creatures because we're so conceptually flexible. And so what seems to have happened, maybe males started selecting each other for in dominance competitions for something like cognitive flexibility and conscientiousness. It's something like that. So that would be the ability to abstractly represent the world, and then the ability to operate effectively within it, to represent yourself socially in a way, and then to carry through with that, because that enables people to trust you. So it's something like that. And so that produced cortical expansion, and then women were selecting men who were good at that, and that produced cortical expansion. And then there's an arms race between women and men with regards to intelligence. So the women kept up, or they certainly kept up with intelligence as the evolutionary cycle continued. But one of the consequences of selection for cortical expansion and increased cognitive flexibility was that the number of dominance hierarchies that human beings could produce started to multiply, right? Because there's all sorts of ways that you can be successful. You think about how many ways you can be successful in a modern culture, and you can be successful in dimensions that aren't really even associated with each other. So you can be successful socially, that's what an extrovert would do. You could be successful in terms of intimate relationships, that's what an agreeable person would do. A disagreeable person would be more successful with regards to competition. A person who's high in neuroticism would be trying to protect themselves and to establish some sort of security. An open person would be looking for a flexible, creative environment. And so there's this multiplicity of ways that you can establish a dominance hierarchy and be successful in it. And if you're creative, you can come up with your own damn dominance hierarchy, which is exactly what you're doing if you're creative, right? You spin up a game that's your game, and then you make the rules. And that's hard, because if you make a new game with new rules, it's hard to monetize it. But you can be the best at playing that game, and so that's a huge advantage to being creative if you can pull it off. So then you think, well, what's happened among human beings is the multiplication of the set of possible dominance hierarchies, so it's become very broad. And then you could say, well, what's driving selection now is the ability to be successful across multiple sets of dominance hierarchies. And that accounts, at least in part, for our cognitive flexibility. And so that's really what a human being is. A human being is a creature that has high potential for succeeding across a very wide range of potential human dominance hierarchies. And so that gives us our transformative psyche. That's the niche that we've both produced and occupy. And I think it's out of that hero mythology emerges fundamentally. Because I think what the hero is, the mythological hero, is a representation of that part of the psyche that's particularly good at being successful across sets of dominance hierarchies. It's a very, very biological way of thinking about it. And I've thought about this for a long time. I can't see any way that just can't be the case. I mean, how else could it work? If we had a fixed behavioral pattern like beavers, you're the most successful beaver if you build the best dam, it's like fine, then you know what's going to be selected for. But that isn't what people are like, and it's also why we're so multi-purpose, We have hands. What's a hand for? What's the evolutionary function of a hand? Well, you can't specify that. You could say it's something like, well, a hand is useful for doing a whole bunch of different things with. Well, and mouth, tongue, same thing. What are words for? Well, it's the same thing. They're for communicating a very wide range of information. It's something like that. So we're these weird general purpose animals. We're not great at any one thing, but we can swim better than most terrestrial animals. We can run faster than most animals, and we can certainly run longer. Like a human being can run a horse to death over the course of a week if they're in good shape. So like we're really good at being a multi-purpose entity, like a rat, they call rats weedy species because they can be anywhere. They don't have a specific niche. Like, there's animals down in the Amazon that they're specialized for like one tree, or one type of tree in one tiny little area. That's not what human beings like, because we're like cockroaches or rats, which is a nasty comparison, but we can go anywhere and thrive. And so being particularly good at that, being particularly good at being able to go anywhere and thrive, also seems to me to be a canonical element of the hero mythology. So okay, all right. Now, I started to introduce all those topics because I was trying to address the issue of how it is that we've come to deal with the fact that things are so complex that we can't deal with them. And so a huge part of the answer to that is the Darwinian answers. One is, well, you keep up with things you can't keep up with by changing unpredictably. So here's an example. You know, sometimes if you're driving down the road and there's a deer on the road, maybe you'll run into it and it'll, instead of jumping out of the way, it sort of jumps randomly and then you run into it. You think, well, that's a pretty stupid strategy. It's like natural selection's at work there, but it turns out that deer jump randomly when wolves are chasing them. Well, why would you do that? Well, because you can't predict it, right? If something horrible is after you, acting unpredictably is actually a pretty good strategy, and that's basically what mutation does. It means the horrible thing that's after you always is the rapid transformation of the environment, and the only thing you can possibly do in that case is capitalize on chance. Okay, so that's one thing. So that's partly why the Darwinian story, I think, has to be right, because the environment does move unpredictably. And the only way you can keep up with something that's unpredictable is to generate variance and hope that one of them has drawn the lucky lottery card. But then there's these additional issues, which is that we also seem to be tightly selected for the capacity to cooperate and compete, so that multiplies our cognitive ability. That's a huge part of it. And then we also seem to have constructed ourselves, so to speak, through sexual choice into these general purpose problem-solving creatures. And so we've internalized some of the Darwinian process. So you think, well, most animals will produce variants of themselves physically, and then most of those variants die. But human beings have built a mechanism, let's say, that's like a game engine. I think that's a really good, you know how there are game engines now that people have devised, they're computational devices, and you can take a game engine and you can generate games with it, like computer games. So the game engine is a mechanism for producing games. Well, that's what our brains are like. Our brains are game engines for producing games. And so what happens is that when you think you produce an avatar of yourself, you produce a fictional world that avatar inhabits, and maybe you produce multiple fictional worlds and multiple avatars. That's the you that could be tomorrow, which is what you're doing when you're planning. And you walk the avatar through its potential routes, and those that look good you keep, and those that don't look good you kill. And so then you can embody the ideas that you keep and act those out, and hopefully the idea is that when you embody them, you're successful and you don't get killed. And so when we've been selecting each other for cognitive prowess, we've been selecting ourselves for the ability to generate avatars out of ourselves and kill them instead of dying. It's unbelievably brilliant. And that's really akin to the human discovery of the future, right? The future is a place where variants of you could exist. It's something like that. And other animals don't seem to be able to do that. So we're very sneaky. And, well, so far it doesn't seem to be working too badly, although we haven't been around for very long, right? I mean, human beings of our particular subspecies, about 150,000 years, something like that, which is, from an evolutionary time frame, it's nothing, you know. It's 2,080-year-old men. It's not very long, you know, if you think about it that way. Okay, so now what I want to do is draw a relationship between that developmental process, that evolutionary process, and the emergence of these underlying motivational systems. It's something like this. So you imagine, go back in time to the emergence of the development of nervous systems. So there's cells that creatures use to produce motor output, and there's cells that creatures use to map the patterns around them onto themselves, and so that's the sensory layer, so to speak. Imagine sensory layer, nervous layer, motor layer. In simpler animals, you just have sensory motor cells. Then they diversify: sensory layer, nervous layer, motor layer. In fact, that's actually what you consist of when you're first developing in utero. After the blastocyte stage, when your cells differentiate, that's the differentiation: sensory layer, nervous layer, motor layer. So then you think there's a sensory layer. Now what's that sensory layer doing? think about the world as consisting of patterns of all sorts. Like maybe there's an animal in the ocean and it's being subjected to wave motion. And so its sensory systems map the wave motion onto the motor output. So if you look at a sponge, for example, sponges are good examples because they're sort of half unicellular animals and half multicellular animals. You can take a sponge and run it through a colander and separate it out into cells, say in salt water, and it'll assemble itself back into a sponge. So it's sort of at the, yeah, amazing, eh? It's kind of what you do in utero. The cells somehow know enough to communicate with one another to organize themselves into an organism. It's unbelievable. We have no idea how people do that, because when you're in the initial form, blastocyte form, all those cells are identical genetically. And then all of a sudden they differentiate and they move to the places they're supposed to go. We have no idea how the hell can that happen? These cells are all identical except for their position. So they're obviously communicating with one another in some unbelievably complicated way and saying, well, you're this sort of cell, and so you're going to differentiate that way. God only knows. But anyway, sponges can do this. Now, a sponge isn't complicated enough to have the sensory layer and the nervous layer and the motor layer. It's just sensory motor cells, if I remember correctly. But what the sponge is trying to figure out is it wants to get water through its pores inside, because that's how it eats. And so there's wave motion constantly, and so what's happening is the wave motion is a pattern, and the sponge is reacting to that in a patterned way. And it's really useful to think about what you're responding to as patterns instead of objects, because we think we react to objects, but objects are actually a specific subcategory of pattern. And so, because it also helps to explain perception. It's like, what does it mean for you to see something? Well, it means a bunch of things, but one of the things it means is, when I look at that thing, it manifests itself to me as a grippable object. I mean, that's built into the way I see it. So if you think about the way that you see that on the surface there, you can tell that it's separate from the surface because it has a bit of a shadow, and it's a different color. And it's obviously shaped for a hand, and so that thing tells you when you look at it that it's a grabbable object. Well, it's hand-shaped, like a stone tool would be. And so, the things around you in the world manifest themselves as patterns of utility. That's the appropriate way to think about it. You say, well, what does this thing mean? Because that's a hard question. Well, one of the things that your eyes do, it's like, imagine you've got this representational surface at the back of your retina. It's made out of pixels, roughly speaking, right? Those are the cells. And what it does is map that pattern onto your retinal pattern. And then the retinal pattern propagates itself as a nervous pattern along your optic nerve, and then that manifests itself as a neurological pattern. And that neurological pattern manifests itself as an action pattern. And so the meaning of the object is the action pattern that is mapped onto the percept. And so what does this mean? This is what it means. You think this is a Piagetian observation. It's like one or many. One, right? Because I'm acting like it's one. But if I do this, then it's many. Why? One, two, right? They're separably manipulable entities. And so the concept of number is, in fact, predicated, at least in part, on the idea of singular usability. But you're mapping it. It's like, well, what is this? It's a key. Well, what does that mean? Well, I'm mapping that shape into this motion for that action. You say, well, it's not just a key. It's a weapon, right? And so that's because I've mapped it onto a different output pattern. But if you think about perception as the matching of patterns onto patterns, it makes way more sense. You can really start thinking about how perception works, because then you can also start thinking about unconscious perception. So, you know, the blindside experiments show, for example, that if you've had cortical damage, so you think you're blind, you can't see objects anymore, but I show you a picture of a frightened face, you'll show a skin conductance response to it, and you think, well, how the hell can that happen? It's like, I have to see the face in order to infer the emotion in order to have the reaction. It's like, no, you don't. You don't need that at all. You need a pattern recognition system that maps that right onto an amygdalic output that produces physiological readiness. You don't need the perceptible entity, because you know, you think, you see something, and then you think about the thing, and then you evaluate the thing, and then you act. It's like, you do that, but there are parts of you that don't do that at all. Way faster parts, more primordial parts. And so another example would be Darwin's trick with the snake that I told you about. He'd go to this museum that had a cobra in a glass cage. And the cobra, he'd put his face up to the glass cage, and the cobra would strike at him. And he'd go like this. And there was no way he could control that. Well, it's because the part of him that saw the snake wasn't the part that was doing this. There's a part of him that does this to snakes. That's what it does. And it's way faster than you figure to see the snake, you have to, the image is obviously the image. The pattern is portrayed on the retina. It propagates backwards. To see it, it has to be elaborated up through a very complex set of neurological connections. That takes time. And so you're dead. Well, the thing that snake means this, that's like 3 neurons. It's super fast. And so what is a snake at that level of representation? It's like a snake is that which makes you do this. And then you could also say that at that level of representation, everything that makes you do this is the same thing, right? Because the same would be defined by the pattern that you manifest in response to that entity. So then your nervous system is layered, that's sensory layer, neurological layer, motor layer. As you become more complex, the sensory layer differentiates into the different sensory systems, and the neurological level multiplies in terms of its potential number of connections. So what happens is that you can map patterns that manifest themselves in multiply different ways to multiple motor outputs. So you start with a fixed action pattern, which is just like the sponge reflex. What's the world to a sponge? The world is what makes you go like this or like that. That's it. That's the whole world. The sponge has compressed the entire world into pores open, pores closed. That's it. 2 states. And then, well, once the nervous system gets differentiated and the senses get differentiated, so there's specialized kinds of cells, then you can detect more forms of patterns. You can produce more patterned output to that. But even more interestingly, and this is where the nervous system starts to come into play, the mapping of the pattern onto the output is no longer one-to-one. You can use the same pattern, roughly speaking, to produce all sorts of different outputs that are context dependent, because you might say, well, so, okay, I picked that up. You say, well, he picked that up. It's okay, well, what about that? You think, well, he picked it up. Well, yeah, I did, except the pattern of musculature that I used to do this is by no means identical to the pattern of musculature that I used to do that, right? I mean, the fact that the orientation is different is actually extraordinarily important. So well, my point is that with sufficient nervous complexity, you can take the same thing, so to speak, and map it all sorts of different ways. And human beings are unbelievably good at that. Okay, so now go back to when things were simple. So there's single-celled organisms, we'll say, and then they start to differentiate to some degree, and they start to propagate. And so then the environment starts to shift, because the fact of the prevalence of all of these competitors means the environment isn't exactly the same as it was when that system first evolved. New problems emerge. And so then there's selection pressure on those creatures to diversify to some degree. And then the diversification produces a transformation in the environment, and then there's pressure on those new entities to diversify some more. And so you get this weird bootstrapping process. Maybe the environment is one thing when there's 10 of you, but a completely different thing when there's 1,000 of you. Right, so just sheer multiplication is going to transform the environment. And so then because the environment has now become more complex than it was, there's selection pressure to produce diversification in the underlying organisms. And that took a long time to get off the ground. Like, there were single-celled organisms for a huge span of history. I mean, if you look at evolutionary history, the amount of time that there were single-celled organisms is far longer than the time that there's been since there were multi-celled organisms. It's like Moore's law, you know, the law that governs the increase in computational power. You can trace that back to about the year 1400, something like that. So it's been going on for a very long time. And maybe you can make the same case from an evolutionary perspective. It's like the flat part of the curve is really long, but once it starts to move up, it starts to move up really fast. And obviously that's the position that we're in now. So single-celled organisms for a long time. Then they started to diversify. And then you could imagine, well, from the single-celled organism, you start getting multicellular organism, and then it ends up with this tripartite structure: sensory layer, nervous layer, motor layer. And then that starts to differentiate. And every time there's a differentiation, that's conserved. And that's these systems, the motivational systems. They emerged a long, long time ago as emergent solutions to emergent problems, and you've conserved all of them. I mean, you've conserved your snake reflex, which is like 3 neurons long. So that's really, really primordial. But you've conserved function at almost every temporal level. So there's parts of you that are quick and dirty, and parts of you that are slow and sophisticated. And a lot of the contents of consciousness is slow and sophisticated. So it can't help you out in an emergency. But it can do, what consciousness seems to do is take your structure, it analyzes the worlds for, let's say, mismatches between what you want and what's happening. And then it either helps you alter the world so those mismatches go away, or it turns inward and modifies the structures that you're using. So if you're playing the piano, you've got this automatized routine. It has very little to do with consciousness if you've practiced enough, and you make a mistake. You stop, and you note the mistake, you stop, and then you slow it down, and then you practice the new thing, and then you speed it up, then you speed it up, then you speed it up. And as you're doing that, the neural representation shrinks until you've developed this little specialized machine, and then you run that a few times, and now you can ignore it. You can look at the notes and just play, and away you go. And that's kind of what consciousness is doing all the time. You're laying out an automatized routine, and then if that doesn't produce the intended outcome, you stop, you become conscious, really, because there's nothing like an error to make you conscious. Then you do a high-resolution analysis of the space in which the error emerged. You rematch your motor output, your perceptions, and all of that to make that error go away, and away you go. And so your consciousness is continually, your consciousness seems to be continually building your unconscious, your procedural unconscious. And so to some degree, the purpose of consciousness is to make you functional unconsciously, right? Because that's way better. You don't want to be conscious of most things, because it's just, what are you going to do? Be conscious of your digestive processes? It's like, no. If you're good at something, you hardly have to be conscious of it at all. So consciousness is something like an error detection and rectification system, something like that. And so you can say, well, you could practice being conscious, because what that means in some sense is you're always attending to your errors. And that seems to be a really intelligent thing to do if you don't take it too far and collapse yourself. Because if you're always attending to your errors, you're always improving your automated adaptability, something like that, right? Pay attention. See if things are working out the way that you want them to, and if they're not, modify your approach, your perceptions. Okay, so you've conserved these systems, and the systems emerge to solve the problems of emergent complexity, and you end up at birth with all of these conserved systems. And so those would be proclivities that would enable you to manifest the necessary realm of behaviors in the social, natural, human environment, something like that. So you're basically prepared for that. And we went through what those were last time, and you can break them down into self-maintenance motivations and self-propagation motivations, something like that. So, okay, now the question is, how do those manifest themselves? And that's where we can make a shift, say, from evolutionary ideas and biological ideas to narrative ideas. So I've made the case for you that you exist within this thing. I've never figured out exactly what to call it, because you can call it a game, or you can call it a frame of reference, which is a pretty good one, or you can call it a story, or you can call it a unit of perception, but that's not exactly right, because it's more than perception. It's really this, what it is a micro-personality. It's your personality as it manifests itself at the highest possible resolution. That's what this is. And so if I'm, say I set myself the task of moving those keys from there to here. So my perceptual frame is, it's this thing. I think, well, what's the world? Everything else can be ignored. I need to make an object out of my hand, these keys, that tiny spot on the table. And my goal is to transform this pattern into that pattern. And it's a pattern because it maintains itself across time, right? It's not like smoke or a cloud. It persists. So there it is, there it is, there it is, there it is. That's a pattern that's extending across time. So I have this goal, which is the transformation of this into that. And that goal, so that would be, roughly speaking, the goal is point B. But you can't just think about this as something that's a goal, because it isn't just a goal. There's a goal, which is the end state of this entire process. The end state is, I've moved the thing from here to here, I've transformed this into this, and I've done it using action. And so that's a useful thing to know too. I have an abstract notion, that's my decision, that I'm going to get the world to manifest this pattern instead of this one. Okay, so that gives me my target. That's an abstraction. But when I actually do the transformation, that's not an abstraction, because now I'm using actual action, actual behavior. And so I take this abstract micro-personality, this is the part that's operating on this tiny little section of the world, I make the transformation, and as soon as I do that, another thing happens, which is I don't need that anymore, right? I move to the next one of those, whatever it happens to be. And so one of the things we're going to have to figure out is, what is the relationship between these things? Because you're always in one of them, and they're scalable. It's like when you're doing a specific action, it's really high resolution, and that's kind of where you want to be operating. When you know what you're doing, that's where you want to be operating, roughly speaking, when you're trying to do something new. But it's scalable. And so the framework, which is constructed in part from these motivational systems that emerged over evolutionary history, the framework specifies the current condition, the desired condition, and the behavioral manifestations that are necessary to make the transformation. And so you can't think about it as a drive, because instincts are often thought about as drives, or as a goal. It's not correct, because the thing actually determines your perceptions. It determines what objects manifest themselves to you in the world, or what patterns. That's another way of thinking about it. Because like when I'm